Good evening. Welcome. I'm Wendy Shattuck, the Chief Communications Officer here at the University of Redlands, and it's really a privilege to again welcome you all here tonight. Welcome our partner, Southern California Public Radio's KPCC, A. Martinez, the KPCC in-person team, members of our university community of students, faculty, staff, citizens of Redlands and the region, welcome, and listeners from all over Southern California. We are really glad that you're all with us tonight. 2018 is drawing to a close. It's been a year of head-spinning news, to say the least, and it's not ending, it seems. Great change, or the prospect of change in the country, the world. Some would say opportunities, some would say challenges, some would say threats, or worse. Tonight's forum and the other conversations on vital topics that KPCC and the University of Redlands have hosted together over the years are all about two things that both of our institutions hold very dear: gathering as a community during complex times, exchanging ideas, facilitating dialogue, and healthy, open, civil discourse. These are part and parcel of what both organizations do. For the university, it's what the liberal arts are all about, and what teaching, living, and learning communities like ours try to foster every day. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining tonight's dialogue. And now I'd like to hand it over to Charlotte with KPCC.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Charlotte Duran. I'm a producer here with KPCC in person. For those of you who are new to KPCC, we are a multi-platform organization. We're on the air, we're online at kpcc.org, and we're in person. We go all over Southern California to do live events. One live event series in particular is our Unheard LA series. We just got renewed for another year. We're very excited about it. If you want to hear more about our community-driven storytelling series, Unheard LA, please check us out, kpcc.org/inperson. There you can find out more about the series and potentially how to become a storyteller. And on that page, you can also opt in to our KPCC in-person e-blast. There you can find out about all of our live events, and some of those you'll be the first people to find out about that event. So that's a great way to hear about what we're doing. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We are live streaming tonight, so we ask that you not record or turn the flash off your photos so that doesn't impact the stream. And then please join us on social media. We will be tweeting, and we're on Facebook, and so you can connect with us there. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's host, Take Two host, A. Martinez.
All right, thank you very much for joining us tonight. As Charlotte said, I'm A. Martinez. I host Take Two on 89.3 KPCC. And we're here tonight to talk about immigration and the Inland Empire and its implications on the region's politics, economy, and a lot more. And you can connect with us tonight on social media at KPCC in person. We're using the hashtag #IEimmigration. And remember, if you have questions, we are going to get to questions. We're going to have time for Q&A toward the end of the discussion, so remember your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. All right, now I'd like to introduce our first guest tonight, Karthik Ramakrishnan, a professor of political science and public policy at the University of California, Riverside, and co-author of the report, State of Immigrants in the Inland Empire. Welcome, Karthik. Welcome.
Thank you, A.
I see you in person. We've talked on the line so many times. It's good to put a face. They always say that to the radio people. It's good to put a face to the voice.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I can't say that I knew what this would be like, but it's different.
Yeah, kind of neat.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So as many times on Take Two as I've borrowed this phrase from Marketplace, you think that Kai Ryssdal is getting royalties, but Karthik, let's do the numbers. Now he has a live band next to him that does the numbers, that number jingle. I don't, but he's Kai Ryssdal. All right, so how many people are in the Inland Empire are immigrants?
So about 1 million, right?
About 1 million, okay.
And to put that in context, that's about 1 in every 5 residents in the Inland Empire is foreign-born.
Foreign-born, okay.
Yeah, and so that's the kind of number that I think is shocking to a lot of people, because that's not the dominant image that comes to mind when you think Inland Empire.
What is the dominant image?
Dominant image is usually either thinking, I mean, if you think racially, most people think the Inland Empire is white, but in fact, Latinos are a majority of the Inland Empire now. They think of maybe a bygone era, in terms of not only the racial composition of the population, but even what economic development looked like, and they think of it primarily as a vast region with a lot of space and not a lot of people, and a certain kind of economy and a certain kind of racial composition. And it's very different from the kind of Inland Empire that not only that we see today, but that we've been seeing for the past couple of decades.
When you say a bygone era, do people think of it as like the good old days in a way?
To some extent, right? I mean, and you've had a dynamic, at least in certain parts of the IE, as many people call it, of people trying to move away from population density. And you still have some places in the Inland Empire, like Norco, for example, that are trying to preserve a certain kind of rural lifestyle, even as development encroaches in on these areas.
Now, the million, in terms of how many, is that 1 in 5, 1 in 6? How many?
About 1 in 5.
1 in 5, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's, and one thing I'll say, when we put out this report, I think it struck a chord, because not only do people not think of immigration as an integral part of the Inland Empire, at the time, I don't know if you remember, it seems like ages ago. This is before the June primaries, when there was a lot of controversy over SB 54, which is the so-called state sanctuary law. And it was generating a lot of controversy in our region, including, and also in Orange County. And, so the dominant conversation was about undocumented immigration and about this law. And I think part of the reason why people found our report to be so useful is to have this wider lens in terms of who the immigrants are, what are their contributions, not only to the economy, but to society. But we have a section in this report that talks about the history of immigration in the region. And, so immigration is not something new here, especially when you look at the history of agriculture. You don't have agriculture here without immigration to this region. We're
going to get to the history in just a second. I wanted to know, though, considering the report and considering the very controversial citizenship question that could be on the 2020 census, were people open to sharing who they were to compile this report?
So we are relying primarily on U.S. government data from the American Community Survey, but we also have a qualitative component where people share their stories, and we do have individuals who are undocumented or unauthorized there. There are a very strong set of organizations here working on immigrant rights issues. So I think that over time, I mean, this region has had and still continues to have a bit of a reputation of being more enforcement oriented. There are parts of the Inland Empire that are within the purview of Border Patrol, right? So that's a different kind of, we're within big parts of Riverside County that are within 100 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. The sheriff departments in each county over time, I mean, they had MOUs with the federal government on the 287G program, which encourages cooperation between local law enforcement and the federal government. So there's been that history, but over the last decade or so, you've seen a robust set of organizations that are advocating for immigrants. And I would say over time, they've become more and more effective. And it's not just what you might typically think of as an immigrant advocacy organization. It involves the Catholic diocese. It involves many different types of organizations that see the value of immigrants and the role that they play here in our society.
Okay, so let's get to the numbers part, the breakdown of the numbers a little bit. 1 in 5, 1 million in the Inland Empire. Who are we talking about? Where are they coming from?
So if you compare who the immigrants look like here versus elsewhere, just as in the rest of Southern California, Latino immigrants are a big part of the story here. But what's interesting is that Mexican immigrants in particular are even more important to the immigrant population in the Inland Empire than they are to the population of Los Angeles County.
Wow.
And that too, I think, breaks a lot of stereotypes when people think, if you had to think about what is the place in Southern California that is quintessentially Mexican immigrant, I think most people will still think of Los Angeles.
Center of Los Angeles, yeah.
Right. But Los Angeles has had significant Central American migration for at least a couple of decades, if not longer, right? So here, when you look at the Mexican immigrant population, I mean, it's more generally true of the Latino immigrant population in the region, but you also have particular geographic areas where Mexican immigrants are over-indexed in certain industries. And one of those industries would be agriculture in the Coachella Valley.
Do we know if that flow goes Mexico, Los Angeles, Inland Empire, or is it coming Mexico, Inland Empire?
Well, for some of these industries, it would be directly Mexico,
Direct, okay.
Inland Empire. You have some dynamics of the immigrant population, the first generation immigrant population, say moving to a place like Los Angeles or Santa Ana and remigrating to the Inland Empire. But a lot of the Latino migration into this region are second and third generation immigrants. And it's part of this more general story. People are looking for more affordable housing than what they can find in Los Angeles and Orange County.
That is a fact of life, right, for
Right.
everyone. Now, when it comes to Asian immigrants in the Inland Empire, who are we talking about?
So when you look at Asian immigrants in the Inland Empire, what's interesting is the I don't want to say predominance, but the much greater importance of Filipino immigrants here than Chinese immigrants, and it's a mirror image of what you see in Los Angeles County. So in Los Angeles County, kind of one area of concentration when you talk about Asian immigrants is the San Gabriel Valley.
Yeah.
KPCC territory.
Right there, yeah.
And Chinese immigration is a big part of the story in terms of how the San Gabriel Valley has gotten transformed in the past couple of decades and continues to be transformed. Here, it's, and Filipinos are the second largest Asian immigrant group in Los Angeles County. Here, it's the reverse. Filipinos are the largest Asian immigrant group, followed by Chinese immigrants.
Now, in terms of arriving in the Inland Empire, when did immigrants really start arriving in some significant numbers?
So if you take a step back and look nationally in terms of when you saw a major increase in immigration, the U.S. liberalized its immigration laws in 1965, but you didn't see a big increase in immigration until the 1970s. In the Inland Empire, it was another decade after that. So it was starting in the mid to late 80s that you started to see an uptick in immigration. But you've seen a big increase from 2000 onwards in terms of the growth of the immigrant population here.
And where are they working?
So in terms of where immigrants work, so first of all, I should note that when you're talking about the Inland Empire, these are two very large counties. San Bernardino County is the largest county in the United States, right? And there are different sub-regions. And those sub-regions also have certain specializations when it comes to their regional economies. So in the Coachella Valley, which is in the eastern half of Riverside County, immigrants or agriculture is a big part of where immigrants work.
It was a citrus belt right here, wasn't it, way back in the day?
Yeah, the citrus belt on the western parts of Riverside County and also San Bernardino County. So citrus is not as big when it comes to agriculture now compared to what it used to be. But in the eastern part of Riverside County, you still have significant agriculture, particularly when it comes to things like dates, for example. There's some areas now that are looking at cannabis agriculture. I mean, so that'll be interesting to see what the future of agriculture looks like. In the western parts of the Inland Empire, some of the areas where you see immigrants over-indexed in their sectoral participation include healthcare. So Asian immigrants in the Inland Empire are more likely to be employed in the healthcare industry than immigrants in other parts of Southern California. And there are important institutions like Loma Linda University that has a very big medical facility and a medical school program. Kaiser Permanente has important facilities throughout this region. And increasingly, this relates to a report that we just put out last week, our center put out a report called The State of Work in the Inland Empire. Healthcare is the fastest growing sector in terms of the total number of new jobs that have been created in the last 8 years or so.
In logistics, is logistics in there a bit
Logistics is big in terms of its proportional growth, and also since 2000, logistics, so this includes transportation, warehousing, wholesale trade. These sectors have accounted for a large chunk of the increase in jobs. And one way to think about this is that our region would still have high unemployment were it not for the logistics sector. So the logistics sector involves different kinds of employers. So it could include an employer like Amazon that is engaged in e-commerce. It includes employers like Stater Brothers. It's a big grocery chain in this region. But transportation warehousing also involves UPS, FedEx, major facilities like the Ontario International Airport, the March Air Force Base, the Norton facility in San Bernardino. So part of the reason why logistics is so important for this region's economy is that we're the intersection of two major interstates, the 10 and the 15.
Sure. Yeah.
And so when it comes to container traffic from the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, we are an important node where goods get sorted and distributed internally before they get shipped off for the rest of the country. But LA Metro is such a huge region that increasingly what we've seen in the last decade is a growth of warehouses that serve the metropolitan area. So in many ways, I mean, you see this when you land in Ontario Airport. Warehouses are an important part of the economy and the labor force here, including the immigrant labor force. So when we see that immigrants in Western San Bernardino County are have strong participation in the logistics industry, it's true more generally of workers in the western part of San Bernardino County.
No, of the 1 million immigrants, the 1 in 5, how many wind up getting citizenship?
I should have looked back at my report on this. It's it's from what I remember. So
I think it's half, right?
Okay,
Something
there
like
you go.
half now.
See, I should have checked back on my report.
I was just
before.
guessing. I read it, actually.
But we've seen a big increase in the citizenship rate among immigrants over the last decade, and I think there are a few reasons for that. More generally, in addition to studying this region, I study immigration policy and I study immigration more generally, and what we found is that in previous eras, when immigrant rights are threatened, you have this process of what people call defensive naturalization.
Defensive naturalization.
Right.
Okay.
So naturalizing in order to be able to protect rights before they get taken away, or access to benefits before they get taken away.
So maybe not because you just want to be a citizen, just because you want to protect what you have.
Yeah, so when it comes to acquisition of citizenship, first of all, most immigrants, when they're here for a reason and they've gone through so many barriers to even get here. So of course they love the United States. Part of what keeps them from becoming citizens is, and I say this, by the way, as an immigrant myself. So I moved to the United States when I was 12. There's just this strong kind of psychological pull, thinking that where you were born is such an important part of your identity that by changing your citizenship, you're somehow rejecting your prior self, right? So even if, so immigrants, even if they never actually go back, they entertain dreams of maybe going back or have attachment to that part of their identity that makes it really difficult to make that final leap and take on citizenship. There are other barriers too. Immigrants may have language barriers, or sometimes it's the financial barriers of paying the fees to be able to become a citizen. But when you have threatening climates, some of those things disappear.
What, has that happened in the last few years? I don't know. I haven't noticed. So that's the last couple, I would imagine.
Yeah.
The last couple of years, we've seen an increase.
You've seen a big surge in naturalization applications. What we have also seen, and unfortunately this hasn't been talked about too much, Reuters did an investigative report about 1.5 years ago about how the Trump administration is dramatically slowing down the approval process for naturalizations. So the backlog for naturalization has been going up dramatically. So you're seeing very high level of interest among immigrants to naturalize, but they're not becoming citizens nearly as quickly as they would like to.
Okay, Karthik, don't go anywhere. You're going to stay with me on stage the entire night. Karthik and I touched on all the kinds of industries that immigrants are working in the Inland Empire. Let's dive a little bit deeper, and I'd like to welcome Nathaniel Cline, Assistant Professor of Economics here at the University of Redlands. Nathaniel, welcome.
Good to be here.
Good to have you. All right.
Yeah,
now,
thank you.
first off, give us a quick history of what industries laid the foundation for the economy here in the Inland Empire.
Right.
Go
Well,
back.
so
Go way back.
Yeah,
Get in the
yeah.
way back machine.
Well, I think the modern Inland Empire is really a function of the World War II economy and the New Deal, in the sense that wartime industries established there and Air Force bases and military employees and all that sort of stuff continued on through to the present era. But there was also the creation of lots of private manufacturing, steel production, right? The very famous Kaiser steel mill in Fontana as a result of these military expenditures. And that was true for the Inland Empire roughly from 1945 through to the 70s. We had a high degree of manufacturing, a high degree of military employees, and a high degree of steel. It's after that point, really, after the 1980s, that international competition sort of ends the steel industry. Fontana ends up laying off a lot of workers, then finally scrapping the entire Kaiser steel mill and selling it off to China. We also see at the same time the closure and elimination of a lot of military jobs and also foreign competition in terms of manufacturing. And so the Inland Empire at that point faces, I think...
And are we talking about like the 90s, end of the Cold War around that time?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And even a little bit earlier, even into the 80s. This is a time in which the United States is going through a deep recession. And the Inland Empire is sort of faced with this choice. The region as a whole really is faced with this choice. How do we survive in a world in which manufacturing jobs are essentially being decimated before our eyes? And the response of the region, in many ways, was to use the routes that have been established for the military transportation to develop the ports of Long Beach and LA. The idea essentially was, if we cannot manufacture these goods anymore, our region can perhaps be the center of their distribution of our imports from abroad. And so that's really the roots of the logistics center out here. Since that time, we've had the development, I think as we mentioned earlier, of the healthcare industry as another large industry in our region. And the decline, really, of agriculture, as we mentioned, the citrus groves and such have been plowed down to make room for residential development and so on and so forth.
How much did just plain space have anything to do with logistics becoming a booming business in the Inland
Yeah,
Empire?
that's a really good question. And I think in a lot of people's minds, there's something sort of natural, I think, about the logistics development. That is that we are located next to two very busy ports, and we have very cheap space with which to store large containers. And in some sense, that's true, but let's also not forget the degree to which the cheapness of the space and also the infrastructure that connects us to those ports was the result of active government policy. So the Southern California Associated Governments have for decades been sort of planning the inland region as a center for warehousing. They have built the roads, the airports, the trains in order to support that infrastructure. They have gotten federal money to support the two ports of Long Beach and LA. So there is a sense in which the natural environment lends itself to warehousing, but I think probably much more important is active government policy. I mean, this was a choice in the face of declining manufacturing. This is the road the Inland Empire picked.
Now, Nathaniel, when it comes to foreign-born workers, what drew them to the warehouse industry, in particular, logistics?
Well, so I think one thing I'd point out, as Karthik said earlier, we have to be careful when we say what drew immigrants to a particular industry, because the immigrant experience, even in the Inland Empire, is really diverse. So when I look, for instance, at the data on Mexican-born immigrants, there is indeed a high concentration in the transportation sector. When I look at the foreign-born who are Filipino, I see a high concentration, as we mentioned, in healthcare, but not in the warehousing sector. So there are really strong ethnic divides in industries in the Southern California region. So what drew immigrants, in particular immigrants from Mexico, to the logistics industry? We know there's a couple things that drew a lot of workers in our region to the logistics industry. One is that there are very low educational requirements, and in general, there are fewer workers in the Inland Empire with college degrees than, let's say, in LA County. However, there's also a way in which the logistics industry played a special role for particularly vulnerable immigrants, those who had undocumented status, and that is they were using, and they continue to use, staffing agencies which hire temporary employees. And we know that those staffing agencies are generally the place folks can go and know that they will not run into E-Verify or other kinds of roadblocks in getting hired based on their immigration status. So in that sense, there is a very special draw to that industry through the staffing agencies for a particular portion of immigrants. But in general, it's the same story for everybody around here. It's a low education requirement and a fast-growing sector.
Now, there was a report out of UC Riverside titled State of Work in the Inland Empire. Karthik, you had nothing to do with that one, I don't think. Did you have something to do with it?
I had something to do, but
Okay.
Ellen Reese was the lead author.
Okay,
on
yeah.
that.
Now, what stood out to me was that while the Inland Empire added 300,000 jobs since July 2010, that was the peak of unemployment, a little under 40% of those jobs, and I spoke to Ellen on Take Two about this, 40% of those jobs, they don't pay enough for working families to make ends meet.
Yeah.
How do those two stats, Nathaniel, square with each other? One that's probably very stressful to live with. One that sounds positive at the start, but then it kind of has a little hammer at the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the conundrums of our region has been that we have had actually some of the fastest employment growth in the last couple years, not only in California, but in the country. I mean, we've had really rapid employment growth. But at least up until recently, wages have not been rising as rapidly as one might expect, and in some periods really stagnating, not rising at all, depending on how you measure it. And so there's a couple answers to that question. I don't think we have a lot of clear answers, but there's a couple answers to the question. One is that even though we have fast employment growth, we still have a huge number of workers who essentially were thrown out of the labor force during the 2008 recession. So that there's still a pool of workers, and that's keeping sort of wages down in the area. The sort of second issue here is that the jobs that have been added since the recession have been, in general, with the exception of healthcare jobs, and frankly, healthcare jobs, there are several kinds of healthcare jobs. There are some that are quite high paying, right, if you're a physician, but then there are also jobs that are like licensed vocational nurses that pay quite a bit less. But many of the jobs that have been added have been in low-paying retail, food service, and warehousing sectors that pay below the median average wage or the median wage for our region. So in that sense, the job growth has actually been dragging our headline numbers down in some ways because the jobs that we're adding simply are low-paying. We also lost, as it turns out, a number of relatively high-paying public sector jobs that have recovered somewhat, but not fully.
Yeah, low wages, then you got layoffs, erosion of benefits, employment opportunities, educational benefits too. I mean, that sounds like a lot of stress to lay on a person that's trying to raise a family.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
automation too, that's another thing. These people are replaced by robots.
Yeah, in particular in the logistics sector,
Yeah.
actually. I do want to just sort of emphasize, though, the degree to which our state level minimum wage policy has affected our region, and it has affected it in some important ways. We know that there are a number of not just minimum wage workers, but workers who earn just above the minimum wage that have been affected by the recent minimum wage increases. So the California State Legislature has passed a higher minimum wage. We're phasing it in over time. And so we know a number of workers in the region have gotten a raise as a result of this. And so that actually has lifted wages in our region. In addition, we know that our region has a high rate of unionization, really compared to the national picture. Not so much compared to California, a little bit higher. A lot of that comes from the public sector, though some of it comes from the private sector as well. And those wages tend to be a lot higher, benefits tend to be a lot better. So there are some bright spots in the region as well.
Yet, okay, so with those bright spots, but also with some of the challenges too, immigrants are still moving to the Inland Empire, right?
Well, sort of.
Okay.
That is, we still have a high immigrant population. I will say that the Inland Empire has followed the national trend that it looks like in the last year or so, we've actually seen a significant drop in the number of immigrants. And that's not unique to the Inland Empire. Again, that's a national picture. What exactly is driving that drop seems to be a decline in Hispanic immigration, primarily from Mexico. There's some suggestion that that might be the result of folks returning to Mexico rather than a big decline in new entrants, so there may be also a decline in new entrants. So we actually have seen somewhat of a decline in the number in the share of immigrants in the last year or so in the Inland Empire. So we actually are seeing some declines.
Now, Nathaniel, we're going to give you a little bit of a break. We're going to bring Professor Cline back up here in just a minute. So, Nathaniel, you could take
Sure,
a quick little time out.
All right.
It might make sense that if you're going to live, work, and pay taxes in a particular region, you might want to start voting for stuff. And if you don't feel like what is important to you is being given any attention, or if you don't see anyone that looks like you in positions of political power, you might want to raise the stakes and actually start running for stuff as well. So for that, I'd like to bring up Italia Garcia, Political Director with the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. Italia, welcome. Good to have you here. All right, let's start with a little Inland Empire Political 101. Historically, on the congressional, county, and city levels, what's been the traditional snapshot of the region's elected leaders?
Yeah, well, similar to what Professor Karthik was saying, historically we had seen a predominantly sort of the concept of the good old boys and really predominantly white, established, middle to upper class income folks that were in elected office, right? And I think that is sort of what still follows the Inland Empire at times.
Republican?
Perhaps, yes,
Okay.
definitely. And I think that might have a lot to do with the fact that, as it was mentioned before, the economy, for example, Riverside City back in the 1900s was considered one of the richest cities in the country. And so we did have a high income population, and so that automatically reflected in the representatives as well.
When did that start to change?
Well, I mean, I'd like to say that, you know, I'm not as old as you can tell, but
I thought you said I'm not as old as you.
No, as you can tell. No, I'm not as I'm not as old, but I really think of it. I migrated here myself, right, in 2000, and I was 10 years old at that time, and I think I have personally witnessed, right, the change since the early 2000s. But I think I can pinpoint it to a little bit before 2010, before the 2010 census and redistricting that took place, that we really saw a shift in 2012 at the statewide congressional leadership, you know, electing the first openly gay Asian American to Congress, right? That was a huge thing for the Inland Empire region. And so I think ever since, we've seen a slowly, but steady shift in the representations that we have, in the representatives that we have. And, that's more, I do want to highlight though, that's more on the congressional and statewide level. Because I think a lot of times people, we get, sort of get hung up on the idea, well, you have, a gay representative, it must be a really progressive area. But then you start to trickle down into the county and the local level, and it does not reflect the demographic changes that we have.
What do you think sparked it, though? What do you think got people politically active, especially immigrants?
I think it was a lot of organizing and mobilization and very intentional work from organizations that have really taken it upon themselves to drive, not just, to take out folks to the streets, but really the concept of today we march, tomorrow we vote, right? So I think that concept has really taken a deeper dive, and communities are also live in fear, but at the same time they have transgressed their fear into action. And I really think, demographical changes, immigrant communities feel more empowered. I myself have worked on a lot of citizenship efforts, and I can tell you, when I've helped these folks, go into their interview, translate at their interviews, and they are eager to vote. That's one thing I'll tell you. They are eager to cast their vote, and they tell their family members, and then it starts to trickle down, and all of a sudden, an entire family who were legal permanent residents for 20 years, they're all citizens. And so that sort of change continues to happen, as we see.
Was there any sense of, hey, that issue is not important to me, this issue is important to me, but no one's listening to what's important to me? Was there any sense of that, and feeling like, hey, if the only way I can make this issue important to a lot of people is to run for things, is to go out and vote, is to go out and become a citizen?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have seen is to have candidates. I think that has been a driving force, actually, to take folks out to the polls, perhaps, specifically immigrant communities, right? To have candidates that perhaps look like them, speak the language, and really reflect their values. And so I think that's sort of been, now we're having, more millennials running, more people of color, more folks from diverse backgrounds. And that really drives people, because you're able to relate to somebody and say, hey, that person went through similar things that I went through. They probably understand my struggle, they understand my background, and that motivates people to go out to the polls, right? Versus the concept of, oh, my vote doesn't matter, it doesn't count. It really, the oppressed mentality, I think slowly but surely, it's starting, the immigrant community is starting to overcome that.
When it comes to political ideological differences between the way it used to be and this new group, wouldn't they both be the same? Everyone wants a good job, everyone wants to make money, own a home, have a little slice of the American dream. Have there been big differences between a new rising political class and the one that was here before?
I agree with you. I think that everyone wants jobs, right? Even when we talk about the economy, I can tell you from, my own my family's, perspective, they like to work. Immigrants, we like to work. Putting myself through college with 2 jobs, we're not afraid of the hard work, right? But I think what we're seeing now, and if I can also, put in the millennial perspective, if I may, right? I think now we're starting to think of things of not just having the opportunity, but having an equitable opportunity, right? So to making sure that not everyone only has an education, but has a quality education, for example, right? That yes, maybe K through 12 or even, college might be free and accessible, but is it actually, or is it a quality education for everyone, right? Is it only in one area, perhaps, that education is better than another? And I think that's sort of what it's starting to change, that we want to level the playing field, that, folks want to level the playing field and make sure that everyone has a shot at the American dream, or everyone has a shot at living a good life in the region, and a quality of life, because I think no one argues against that we all want a good quality of life and quality jobs. And that's sort of really, I think that's sort of the difference, right? Not necessarily in the core values of wanting to succeed, but more of how we get there.
When it comes to this need for employment, and one of the things that I think about when I read your report and when I've been reading about Inland Empire and economic growth and jobs, is that maybe some of the businesses that have provided jobs over the years, how did they fit with the needs of the region? Because I'm thinking of logistics, and that means pollution. That means space for warehousing, but maybe not space for housing. So when it comes to that, is this new rising political class thinking about those things as opposed to, hey, we just need jobs, and I don't care what happens as a result of those jobs being here? Are they thinking about these wider issues?
I think there's a bit of a mix. I think we actually see both, right? We see folks that live day to day and they are focused on just having food at their table and just going to work, coming back, and sort of living their life, right? But we are seeing a growth, especially among the young folks, right? We're seeing a growth in being very environmentally conscious, being also, thinking, how do we invest a little bit more smart, right? I would say smartly, right? In the sense that sometimes it just doesn't make sense to put, a warehouse or, right in front of a school or right in front of a house, right? I don't think no one has argued that we shouldn't invest in the logistic industry, right? But how we get there, once again, it's sort of the difference, right? And I think that we still see a shift, sort of the differences, right? Folks are full force, I don't care how it gets done, just give me a job. But then we also see a growing, and I would want to say more towards a young millennial concept, right, of making sure that we do it in a way that's not harming our neighbor, right? In a way that we're being strategic about it and that we are actually taking other factors into consideration and being also, culturally sensitive and, and such.
Is the immigrant millennial mindset different than, say, the typical millennial?
I think
you're the youngest person on the stage,
know, right?
Natalia.
I think so, yeah. But then there is also within the immigrant or the Latino or just the immigrant millennials, you have a lot of different, I would say, subcategories, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you were fortunate enough to have an education, most likely your mindset, it's gonna be different than those folks that are not. And so I think if anything that sort of bridges or that makes a difference is education. I think folks, millennials, are not just one category, right? Although a lot of trends and things bring us together, I think there's a lot of differences, especially within the immigrant community, even when you talk about DACA recipients versus non-DACA recipients, right? There is, or folks like myself who were, students before the California Dream Act, before other resources were granted in the state and opportunities. I want to say that we sort of look at things differently than the upcoming, sort of younger folks that have more opportunities for them.
I'd like to bring Nathaniel Cline back in here for a second. We're going to take your questions coming up in just about 10 minutes, but Nathaniel, come on back here real quick. Karthik, with your report, State of Immigrants in the Inland Empire, I think we're getting a clearer picture of what's here. What do you hope your report achieves when it comes to policy, when it comes to just how people that aren't in the Inland Empire see this region?
Well, we have different kinds of audiences for a report like that, and I think we've helped to change people's perceptions of our region, both within and outside. So I'll credit Take Two for this. Your audience is it covers the Inland Empire, but there are big parts of Los Angeles County that listen to your show. That made a big difference in terms of people there when they hear about the Inland Empire, there are a whole host of things that they might think about, but they don't think about the immigrant population. So I think we've helped change that narrative in terms of the importance of immigrants to the region. One thing I'll say about not being a millennial immigrant, what I do see that is exciting about the millennial immigrant population is that a lot of their politics is intersectional and challenges some of especially if you're looking at Latino, immigrant, and Chicano mobilization prior, it was very male and non-intersectional at all. In fact, one of the things I will credit a lot of millennial Latinos is this term Latinx, right? as opposed to using Latino or Latina, right? So to try to think about the implications of using those binary gender terms. And that goes so deep, right, in terms of how we think about immigrant politics. A lot of people who are active on DACA are queer, right? And so coming out as undocumented, they drew power, and also they're coming out as gay as well. And so that, to me, it's a very different kind of immigrant rights politics than what we had seen with older generations.
And Latinx just sounds so cool. It sounds like a superhero. Like I want to wear a cape too. That's another thing. Nathaniel, we were talking with Italia about the jobs here and the industries that are here. Do you think that, considering, and you mentioned all the things that were here in terms of policy and planning that caused all this, but do you think that the mindset now, with maybe a different kind of way of thinking, might change the way an Inland Empire immigrant worker will interact with this place, say 20, 30 years from now?
Well, I certainly hope so. The problem here is that there is an enormous infrastructure that is built around existing industries, and so turning that ship around is a very difficult thing to do. The other issue here is that we have in the Inland Empire a very particular political situation in which we have a bunch of polities. Many local governments cover the sort of two counties, and what ends up happening is they end up finding themselves in competition for tax revenues. And that lends a very particular kind of local policy that is biased, I think, towards status quo. What I mean is, you have localities competing, say, for instance, for a distribution center through tax abatements, through giving, tax cuts and that sort of thing. And so when they think about planning land use, for instance, in their locality, what they're thinking about primarily is tax revenue for their locality. And what that means is that we then get warehouses sort of scattered randomly throughout the region, when a much more sort of reasonable or rational way to do it would be to concentrate warehouses away from residences, away from schools, and that sort of thing. So there is, but that's not happening because these localities are in direct competition with each other. There's not a lot of incentives for cooperation. So my concern here is that both the physical infrastructure, but also the political infrastructure of our region is sort of biased towards a sort of a status quo. The only sort of light here, in some senses, is the rise of the healthcare industry, though there's some questions about that as well.
It's hard to give up what's already here, right?
That's right.
I want to portray a slightly different take on this, and I think, so in addition to our center being involved in the State of Immigrants report, I'm the research lead on a project that involving the Brookings Institution and a whole bunch of civic leaders. And, I would say from that work, and even beyond that, I mean, yes, we want to acknowledge some of the kind of dominant kind of economic developments here, but we're here in Redlands in terms of what Redlands looks like in terms of major employer here, Esri, a lot of high-skilled labor, in terms of the development of downtown and the connection to the Metrolink line, the extension from San Bernardino here. I mean, there are different kinds of developments going on here. City of Ontario, yes, Ontario has a fair number of warehouses. There's a big entertainment district that is being built that might not be the same as LA Live, but it's already quite significant. Citizens Bank Arena has a ton of performances where the immigrant, especially first and second generation Mexican immigrant population, has kind of made a big market there. I mean, so you have Lucha Libre, for example, recently. You've had, and many Mexican pop stars that perform, and also U.S. pop stars that are now performing in the Inland Empire. Downtown Riverside is going through this major kind of cultural revival in terms of the assets that are being built there. There are many other examples. The California Air Resources Board is moving from El Monte to Riverside. So there are big investments happening. I do recognize that forces that are status quo oriented will be strong, but looking ahead, I feel quite optimistic in terms of what the future will look like. I think even when it comes to logistics, Little Hoover Commission just put out a report in terms of artificial intelligence and what that'll mean. Yes, there are these concerns that it'll mean massive loss of jobs, but probably what it'll mean in this region is that work and logistics will become more high-skilled. People who have those jobs will need to learn how to work with machines, either designing those systems, repairing those systems, or interacting with those systems. I think this is part of what we will expect out of Amazon as well. Right? They had that $15 minimum wage. Now there's some tinkering around in their compensation, but increasingly what you'll see is Amazon's total labor costs probably won't go up that much because they're going to increasingly rely on higher skilled labor working with machines to have even higher productivity than they have now. So I think the future of our region, even in a sector like logistics, is going to look quite different 20 years from now than it has in the last 10 years.
Then, Nathaniel, looking ahead 20 years, when it comes to establishing a sense of permanence, how much is political involvement in a region an anchor to keep people around? Because if jobs leave, people tend to leave too.
I think it's a big component. I think it's actually one of the reasons why we're seeing such a change in a lot of these, innovative ways of brightening up the cities, right? In my perspective, because a lot of times, we're seeing now the sort of the cultural understanding that we need to serve the populations that we have, right? And I think that's going to also come with the representation. So I think over time we're seeing, just for example, Harupa Valley just had their first election by district, right, since they became a city in 2011, and they're just now electing their first 2 Latinos, and in a 60% plus majority Latino city. And so we're seeing that should reflect into representation that's really going to make sure that it's culturally sensitive, that it's reflective of the interests of the demographics, of the constituents, and not just that, but that folks are paving the way for these high-skilled jobs for the immigrant communities as well. Because I think there's a lot of times when we think of high-skilled jobs, we tend to forget that there's still a lot of folks that might not be, immediately college ready, or they're not going to be doctors or architects or, engineers right off the bat, but they still got to make sure that they keep up with the driving force of the economy. And so we got to make sure that, the folks that are representing us and folks in the decision-making process really got to make sure that we're providing the tools necessary, the resources to get our immigrant community into these jobs and into whether it's breaking the barriers of language, whether it's breaking the barriers of education, and overall just investing in the communities that are going to continue to uplift us and uplift the economy.
So Nathaniel, then going off of what Karthik and Italia just said, when it comes to getting these higher paying, higher skilled jobs, immigrants might have to make a choice, right? Pursue education or keep trying to make that quick buck. That's sometimes a very tough decision to wrestle. And then how does that affect the economy going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I would say that our local institutions, University of Riverside, Cal State University San Bernardino, have done really great jobs at social and economic mobility, of transforming a community that may have difficulty with language, with cost of tuition, and so on and so forth, and getting them into moving them up the occupational ladder. So we are doing that to some extent. One small thing I think that's worth pointing out that's I think related to my current research is that there is a gap in the wage earned by a native non-Hispanic worker and let's say a Latinx immigrant. That gap persists at all educational levels. So one sort of asterisk, I think, when we talk about sort of upskilling our workforce is that we have to understand that simply getting college degrees is not enough to achieve the kind of economic integration that we really want for the immigrant community. So that actually I find in my work for Latinx immigrants who have a bachelor's degree, we're talking that they're about earning somewhere between $7 and $8 an hour less than native workers, non-Hispanic workers with a college degree.
So getting that degree is not enough.
Yeah, now, to be clear, they're earning more than if they hadn't gotten the degree. And so the degree is absolutely worth it. What I'm saying is that we still have challenges even after the skills are acquired. We have challenges both in further integrating the non-native population into our economy, but we also have challenges in establishing the kinds of jobs that will demand those skills, right? What we don't want as an industry or as a region full of folks with bachelor's degrees driving Uber, right? We want a region that has the demands for their education. We don't want folks being what in economics we call underemployed. So there's really two sides to this coin, right? We want to make sure that we are doing more than just educating, that we're doing a lot more than just educating.
Now, I think we're ready for questions. If you got questions, let's see if people lining up on the left and the right. So let's start over. Oh, here we go. All right, here we go. First question, what is the union demographic representation and also into labor leadership in the Inland Empire? The current speaker noted Inland Empire political leadership is not representative. Can labor change that? That's a Twitter question, actually. I was wondering, because Quincy's handwriting. This is your handwriting. Okay. No one puts Quincy in a corner. We put him in a corner today. So there you go. So, okay, let me repeat that question. What is the union demographic representation and also into labor leadership in the Inland Empire? The current speaker noted Inland Empire political leadership is not representative. Can labor change that? Who wants that one? Nathaniel?
Sure. Well, I'll say just a small, I'm sure that my co-panelists will have something to add, but I do want to say that the organizing strategy of unions in this region that I've sort of only recently become familiar with, but have been following since then, has actually been, it's compared to other areas that I've paid attention to, much more aware of the immigrant population, and organizing has been much more centered around the immigrant population in our region. Having said that, we know that nationally, and it's very hard to get data on this at the local level, we know that nationally, immigrants are much less represented in unions, and the reason is because they're concentrated in industries that don't seem to be as unionized. And so, for instance, in the Inland Empire, the dominant unions are public sector unions. And we actually do see less representation in the public sector from immigrants than in other sectors. So organizing, I think, on the organizing front, on the political advocacy front, unions have been acutely aware of immigration issues. Whether that's turning out to mean that immigrants are covered by unions or not is a different story.
All right, we have a question right here in the front.
Ukaiba has a business incubator, the city itself. Are there any other organizations in the Inland Empire that are looking to do small business incubation? And is there also any type of microfinancing organizations here that could invest in startups for either support in logistics or new industries? Because we don't want to be just dependent upon logistics in this area.
So one thing I'll say, so we have people like Ellen Reese and myself and a bunch of others at UCR and in other institutions in our region that have been doing community engaged work for a while. But we launched our Center for Social Innovation formally earlier this year. And we call it the Center for Social Innovation. It's a very deliberate choice. It's to highlight the kind of innovations happening here. Some of it is in the form of incubators that you see here locally. There are incubators in Riverside and Palm Springs area and elsewhere. But there's a lot of social innovation happening, often not even in formally constituted nonprofits. And I think it's important for us to not only talk about the challenges in this region, but just looking at the sheer talent and the kind of change makers that we have. So what we say when we talk about social innovation is that when people think about innovation happening in California, they think about it predominantly as happening on the coast, starting with Silicon Valley, right, with high tech and biotech, entertainment tech in LA, and then biotech down in San Diego. But in inland California, you have a lot of social innovators who are just not being recognized. The kind of talent we have here is incredible. We might not have the same kind of infrastructure or the recognition from those who finance innovation in the Bay Area and elsewhere. And we need to change that. So I think we need to build more bridges between the kind of investors who are in regions that are, I mean, one of the jokes you hear of in the Bay Area is that, you know, you have more venture capitalists than you can throw a stick at, right? Or if you throw a stick, you'll hit like at least 5 probably, VCs, yeah. Right? So in many ways, I think if you're looking at the economic situation here, this looks like the Midwest of the United States in a lot of ways. And so just as Silicon Valley is thinking about how it can produce more social good in the interior of America, why not just look at the interior of California and the kind of social good that can be produced if only people invested more in our regions and supported the kind of entrepreneurship, both, say, on the economic side, but also on the social side.
Because one of the things when it comes to an immigrant group moving to a region is that aside from the jobs they do, there's other things that can spring up as a result. So say you've got Filipino immigrants, you're going to want maybe a Filipino restaurant or a market or all kinds of different things that serve that community. That's something we probably don't have time to get into, but it probably has a lot to do with some of the economy and industries that are popping up in the Inland Empire.
Yeah, and I would just make a small addition to that point. Immigrants in our region are actually overrepresented in business ownership. So we have about a third of the businesses in the Inland Empire owned by immigrant citizens, or by immigrant residents. So there is an enormous entrepreneurial spirit among the immigrant community in the Inland Empire that indeed could be well served by greater financial access.
And Italia, when you mentioned how you immigrated here from Mexico, when you see a region that has stuff from Mexico, like a market or a restaurant, I mean, it has to feel at least comforting, at the very least.
Yeah, I think it might be a little bit different for Mexicans, right? Because I feel like everywhere you go now in California, yes, it feels like somewhat in Mexico, but it really does. And I think even, recently the legislature approved the food truck and the concept of food truck vending and street vending now, and LA approved their sidewalk vending. And so I think that has a lot to do with even the representation now, right? When we talk about being culturally sensitive and aware that we got to serve what the demographics really, want and what folks want. And a small business concept is very heavy in Mexico, small food trucks or, as they call it, tienda de abarrotes, right? Like little small stores where you can find literally anything. Those are all things that a lot of the times that we're seeing that it is changing even our economy, and a lot of people aspire to have those here in the United States, when they immigrate.
Can we get another question right there?
Thank you. When we talk about the logistic developments, I wonder that is inherently discriminatory, because we don't see warehouses going to Temecula, Redlands, or Corona, but we see them in Moreno Valley or Paris. You may say that that's because the workers are, but I say it's because it's poor communities that don't have the leverage to prevent those kind of developments. I know you work in an agency that is called for development justice. So what is the role to affect those conditions of these poor communities getting those type of low-income jobs?
Well, that's the interesting part of this too, right? Who wants a warehouse in their backyard? I don't know if many people want that.
But how many people have Amazon Prime, right? I mean, this is the thing. Like, it's such an important part of our lifestyle. I think the key is, how do we do this in a way that is sustainable, that honors the contribution of workers, that is done in an environmentally sustainable way. I think this is where you need to have both. I think having a kind of mobilization strategy and then to hold employers accountable is important. At the same time, I think you can also try to, I don't want to say that technology is going to solve all the problems, but to the extent that you can start developing clean trucks, right? I mean, this is something with the relocation of CARB to Riverside. So trucking and transportation is such a big part of this region. Well, what if we can innovate in terms of building cleaner fleet vehicles? That would have an enormous change, at least in terms of air pollution levels. Now, it might not solve traffic problems, but there are other things that we can think about. I mean, I think more well thought out and coordinated regional planning could make a difference there. So I think that when we think about, I mean, it's the kind of thing they say about traffic. One can complain about traffic, but at some point the traffic is us. Like, you can't sit in traffic and complain about it because you're part of the problem. So if we're talking about what does it take to make sure that we reap more of the benefits while minimizing some of the social costs, I think that's a more honest conversation than saying, why do we need logistics? Well, that Amazon Prime shipment you just got today is part of the reason why we have logistics here, because most of those goods are getting shipped around regionally here. Of course, international trade is part of it, but what goes on locally here is because of consumer behavior.
And that's a tough balance, right? Because in LA County, we're starting to see now that immigrant populations, say in South LA, are rising up politically. They're saying, hey, why has that factory been here for 60 years? Why have my kids been breathing in this air for a long time? And I guess maybe for the Inland Empire, that's going to be something that will be talked about, right? Or discussed and tried to maybe be dealt with in the future.
Yeah, I think we're dealing with it now, actually. I think a lot of communities are starting to realize, after many studies and reports and really just the environment that we have and the pollution. And so they're starting to realize it. I think it's sort of different in the sense of a lot of times they feel disenfranchised and they feel like there's nothing we could do about it. And also there's also the part of like, well, we're part of the problem, right? Because Amazon Prime and whatnot. But I think it really goes into the concept of, like Karthik said, right? It really goes into the concept of making sure that we do it in a sustainable way and that we get it from all the angles, right? So not just the physical aspect of there's a warehouse here in this place that shouldn't be, but what else drew the warehouse to that place, right? What other driving forces either put it in areas where there's a lot of Latinos or there's low-income communities, and also how do we try to at least minimize and really looking, 20, 30 years from now, where do we want to see ourselves in the industry, and how do we want to make sure that we're not continuing to follow similar trends and continuing to affect our communities, especially immigrant communities who are more vulnerable and who are also have perhaps less access to healthcare and other resources that affect their living conditions.
Another question right here in the corner.
Yes. So with the logistics industry being credited for soaking up the unemployed people, what is the future though with the obvious increased automation that's going to just sweep through the logistic industry, and what's going to happen to us then? We've all this land has been taken over by warehouses, and so that kind of minimizes your alternative for the next future of industry. What's going to happen with automation as it rolls into the thing that saved us from a high unemployment rate?
Nathaniel?
Yeah, just
any Latino robots lying around somewhere?
Well, I mean, I think nationally, or for the economy as a whole, the automation threat is, in my opinion, sort of vastly overstated. When it comes to the logistics sector, however, there may be something to that. And so I think that when we talk about regional planning, we do need to take into account the notion that we are laying down very heavy, hard-to-remove physical infrastructure devoted to an industry that may not provide jobs in the long run, or at least as many jobs. That's a real concern. So the question is, why would communities continue to do this, right? We have large facilities going in Fontana and Bloomington, And the reason is because these communities are searching for sales tax revenues, right? They get counted as point of sale for some of these things. They get some property tax revenue out of it. And so what I think we need to do is to help these communities from a regional perspective solve some of their financing problems so that they can think more rationally about land use and long-range economic planning.
Karthik. So I agree with the kind of, I think it captures the imagination of the robot apocalypse, right? And all of us are going to be eliminated. Little Hoover Commission did a report that just came out last week. And the big concern is not as much job loss, but lack of adequate training for the kind of jobs we need to have to interact with artificial intelligence and the machines. Right? So this is where I think it's a different kind of a gap. I mean, so we know looking ahead, it's not just about getting a bachelor's degree. It's a specific kinds of jobs that will be the jobs of the future, even in an industry like logistics. Yes, we'll probably have total lower employment, but a much bigger worry is that we're not having the right kind of training for the workers of the future in logistics. And this is where you do have efforts like InTech, which is a training center that's a collaboration between California Steel and the community college system to train people for higher skilled jobs in manufacturing and in logistics. You have the ACE Center, the ACE Center in Norco College. You have examples like this. You do need to have larger investments to increase the scale of those operations. Right now, they just seem like good experimental programs, but increasingly, those are the kinds of jobs that we will need for the future of this region.
Got one more question right there.
Yes, I am a resident of Riverside since 2000. And for the first 10 years or 11 years as a resident of Older in Riverside, I was really shocked by the anti-immigrant politics of my congressman at the time, Ken Calvert. And it was very, it was shocking at times. Then we had the 2010 census, the 2011 redistricting. And so we have now Mark Takano, who is very much a progressive on many issues, education, immigration, et cetera. Raul Ruiz is now in Coachella, and Pete Aguilar is in San Bernardino. So from my view of the Inland Empire, moving here in 2000 to where we are today, the dramatic increase, in my view, just being a resident of Mexican-American, and Central American immigrants as a portion of the growth of the population has helped to change from very significantly anti-immigrant congressional members to more progressive members. And so this is something that personally, as a 18-year resident of the Inland Empire, I welcome.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that is you're seeing, I mean, some of the changes below Congress, like Italia said, are longer in coming, including even when you look at Riverside City Council, it's very undiverse by gender and also by race. But even there, you see some hopeful signs. So the Riverside County Board of Supervisors, and this is not a very progressive lot, when comprehensive immigration reform was on the table in 2007, when DACA was being threatened, when comprehensive immigration reform was on the table in 2013, in all of those instances, you had the Riverside County Board of Supervisors affirming the importance of a pathway to legalization. So I think that in addition to whatever might be happening at the congressional level when it comes to partisan politics, even at the local level, I think you're seeing this recognition that immigrants are just so important to this region that even if you might win a few elections here and there being anti-immigrant, it's not a sustainable strategy in the long term.
So even if you don't like them, you gotta kind of nod to them a little bit?
Well, I mean, if you care, but I would say if you care about this region, being anti-immigrant is not a sustainable strategy if you truly care about this region. And more generally, I think what you're seeing is, I mean, the Republican Party in California gambled on immigration as an issue starting in 1994 with Proposition 187 and lost badly. And it's been a downward spiral ever since, in which they've lost even white support over time. and the party's increasingly become an ideological party. Now, colleagues of mine like Manuel Pastor say that, well, that's what the National Party risks doing. The National Republican Party risks getting doomed the way it has in California. The thing is, we're in a federal system. There are a bunch of states that are not going to be diversifying as rapidly as California did over that 20-year period. So when it comes to kind of squeezing the power of anti-immigrant rhetoric, it still might have a few years left. Although I think when President Trump tried to do that in a dramatic way the week or two prior to the midterm elections, I think it showed the limits of even his strategy of trying to mobilize a white conservative base.
Well, the rhetoric is harder, though, in a border state, though. It's a little bit harder to try and sell, it seems like.
Well, but it was easy here in the 80s and 90s when they did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I may just add to that, the concept of the Latinx and the being intersectional, right? We're seeing that reflected in not just policies, but those representing us, right? So I think we, at the local level, which is, for me, I'm very much more passionate about the local level, sometimes even than the federal level, because that's the day-to-day, that reflects the day-to-day struggles for a lot of our immigrant communities, right? The type of roads they have, the type of resources they have in general are very much directly affected by the local decision-making process. And I think sort of to the concept of like, even if they don't want us here, they don't like us here, I think at least, you know, we have a lot of Mexican restaurants, or we have a lot of, you know, really diverse foods and the music. And I think, you know, having that at least cultural, again, the cultural sensitivity and really just trying to bridge that gap, at least in the work that, you know, that I do and a lot of folks on the ground do, is try to bridge the gap between our day-to-day struggles and the representation that we have. And so I think I do look forward to the years ahead, because I do think we're gonna have a lot of changes happening locally.
Food is the tasty political equalizer. It always has been. One more question.
It's actually quite funny because my question is related to food, but I moved here from Orange County, and I'm an immigrant, and I was wondering about the patterns of migration, because the one thing that I miss are the enclaves of migrants, where the food in Westminster is Vietnamese, and Artesia has really good Indian food. And why are those patterns of migration not the same in the Inland Empire? And why don't we have those enclaves of migrants?
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to Asian migration here, it is much more spread out. And it's funny to think about, you know, Artesia and Westminster as ethnic enclaves. You know, I grew up in the Northeast, and there the density is much higher. So if you're talking about, I mean, not even New York City, like talk about Jackson Heights in Queens. It's like one neighborhood in Queens, and you have a lot of different immigrant groups with strong retail and restaurant presence. So it's one thing to talk about LA that seems so much more spread out than New York City, and then talk about Inland Empire, which is even more scattered. I think this is where it's especially challenging for Asian immigrants, where you have enough Latino or Latinx immigrants that you have shopping centers in various parts of the Inland Empire. But when you're talking about getting like good South Indian food, for example, you got to go to Artesia. There's like no other. There's good Gujarati food in Upland.
We're going to start arguments now. I can already feel it. So let's end this discussion tonight with just one question, one for each of you. So for someone listening in, say, LA County, Orange County, Ventura County, when it comes to immigrants in the Inland Empire, Nathaniel, how would you say that people that are not living here should see the involvement, the impact politically, economically?
Well, I think there's no doubt that our region has one of the highest concentrations of immigrant populations for certain demographics in the country. And I think that there is really no doubt, given the level of entrepreneurship, given the level of even things like home buying, consumption, general economic participation, that the immigrant population in the Inland Empire has been a great boon and has contributed to economic growth significantly in the region. and has in many ways altered the pace and pattern. On the flip side of that, I think as we've mentioned earlier, the great challenge then is to work toward further integration of immigrant populations into labor markets, into financial markets, into housing markets, because we still have a long ways to go in those terms.
Italia, same question for you. When it comes to immigrants in the Inland Empire, what should people know about their role in this region?
I think one thing to take away from immigrants in the Inland Empire is that they are hard workers and they persevere, right? I think we have had a lot of hate in this area towards the immigrant communities, a lot of struggles, a lot of, even presence from immigration and law enforcement being, targeting immigrant communities. And nonetheless, we continue to persevere. We continue to work hard through those challenges and work hard through those struggles. And I think that just demonstrates that we, are #here to stay.
Karthik, you wrote the report, State of Immigrants in the Inland Empire. What should people know?
First, when people think about Inland Empire, they have to think about the immigrant population. They have to, at the very least, update their understanding of what the Inland Empire is. But beyond that, I think we need to think about the incredible opportunities here, that we need to actively be involved in to try to take full advantage of those opportunities. We can't just assume that you get people that are inherently, they're looking for a better life, or they may be more likely to be engaged in entrepreneurship. Just bring enough of those people and then, magic will happen. Or you have enough Latinos in a region, you have more than a majority Latinos, automatically your politics are going to change. It's going to take intentional action. And I'm really heartened by the kinds of new leadership we have, not only different individuals coming into leadership positions in politics and higher education and civic life of various sorts, but the fact, I'll just give a very quick example of census. Census 2020 is an incredible opportunity that I see for our region to do collective work. And I've been involved in conversations involving both counties that traditionally had rivalries with each other that are working together on an issue like this. They want nonprofits, including immigrant-serving nonprofits, to be alongside them and trying to make sure that we have a complete count. And that's because our region rises and falls together based on how big or how small our undercount will be. So I'm really optimistic with the kind of new leadership and also new ways of doing business that's starting to happen in the region.
Karthik, Ramakrishnan, Italia Garcia, Nathaniel Cline, thank you very much for coming out.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, University of Redlands, and thank all of you for hosting us here. Thanks.